Olá e seja bem-vindo. A gente tem visto muitas e muitas notícias envolvendo a Interpol e a ditadura brasileira. Está toda hora nos jornais. Alexandre de Moraes mandou incluir o nome do Alan dos Santos, ou do Oswaldo Eustáquio, ou dos vários presos do 8 de janeiro que fugiram da ditadura brasileira. Ele manda incluir na famigerada lista vermelha da Interpol. Recentemente, nós vimos também que a Interpol, aparentemente, não tem cumprido essas ordens. Mas, apesar desse assunto ser objeto de tanta discussão na imprensa, nenhum jornalista brasileiro sabe nada sobre esse assunto. E por isso que a quantidade de bobagem que a gente lê nos jornais sobre Interpol é simplesmente impressionante. Ninguém sequer sabe o que é a Interpol, o que é a lista de difusão vermelha, quais são os poderes, os mecanismos de controle, como é que o Brasil bota o nome de alguém no nome da lista ou não bota. A gente está falando de uma organização internacional poderosa, não governamental, que com frequência funciona como um instrumento de repressão internacional. Há alguns anos, eu pessoalmente passei vários meses ilegalmente incluído justamente nessa tal de lista vermelha. Eu então gastei bastante dinheiro com advogado aqui nos Estados Unidos, e a maioria deles, eu confesso a vocês, nem os advogados criminalistas americanos sabiam muito sobre Interpol. Até que num dado momento eu descobri, por indicação, que uma das maiores especialistas em Interpol do mundo estava baseada, para minha sorte, em Miami, perto de mim. Os anos passaram, meu nome foi removido, mas eu resolvi chamar essa especialista para uma entrevista. Obviamente a entrevista é em inglês, mas nós tomamos o cuidado de legendá-la integralmente para português, para que você tenha acesso direto a esse conhecimento que a velha mídia não te dá. A entrevistada de hoje, doutora Michelle Estlund, é formada em Direito pela prestigiosa Stetson University College of Law, com graduação em Criminologia e Psicologia pela Universidade Estadual da Flórida. Ela é frequentemente requisitada como especialista por veículos de comunicação internacionais, como The New York Times, a Reuters, Al Jazeera, até a National Geographic. Em 2023, ela foi premiada como a melhor advogada do ano em direito penal na Flórida. Ela é editora do Red Notice Journal, que é um dos mais respeitados veículos especializados em informação sobre a Interpol. Vocês vão observar que ela não é uma conservadora ou uma advogada de direita, muito pelo contrário. Mas ela vai desvendar para você a caixa preta dessa poderosa organização internacional misteriosa. Parece coisa de filme, mas a realidade é bastante diferente. E esse tipo de material, ele é só uma pequena amostra do nível de conhecimento que eu ofereço para os meus alunos. Tem muito mais coisa que pode ser explicada, mas não dá para ser explicada em vídeo e live de YouTube. Então, se você é uma pessoa verdadeiramente curiosa sobre o mundo, você quer saber como é que estão tentando controlar vários aspectos da sua vida, sufocar as suas liberdades, eu sugiro que você considere a possibilidade de se tornar meu aluno. E está tendo a minha última turma de O Fim da América e do Mundo Como Conhecemos. São mais de 40 aulas gravadas, com qualidade profissional, professores renomados de todo mundo, tudo para te preparar e te instruir para o que ainda está por vir. Além de todo esse conteúdo, eu entrego em 10 módulos, você vai receber aulas com 16 professores convidados, reconhecidos e conhecidos internacionalmente, tudo legendado em português, 6 meses de acesso grátis ao conteúdo exclusivo do meu site, você tem interação comigo nas aulas ao vivo, enfim, essa é a maior e mais completa formação geopolítica disponível no Brasil e na América Latina. Então, falo para você não deixar para depois, garanta já a sua vaga, tem um link aqui fixado no chat e na descrição da live, mas as inscrições se encerram no fim da apuração das eleições americanas. Então, realmente é uma chance única. Eu convido a você a participar dessa última turma para se preparar e começar a ver o mundo como ele realmente é. Eu vou te transformar. Estou te esperando. Você fica agora com a minha entrevista, direto dos estúdios do Locals em Miami, com a doutora Michelle Estlund.
Hello, everyone. Paulo Figueiredo here, and I'm starting this series interviewing people that I think are very interesting, people that know stuff that we don't. And I decided to start interviewing someone that I met a couple of years ago when I was in need of some good information. So we're going to talk today with Michelle Estlund. She's an attorney specialized in Interpol. She has been doing that for over a decade. and everybody is very interested on Interpol. We have seen Interpol becoming more and more important in world politics. This is especially relevant for us in Brazil because we've been, well, first of all, the next chief or director of Interpol will be a Brazilian guy, but also we've been seeing more and more people being put on the red notice list by the Brazilian Supreme Court for crimes that are considered political crimes. So, and this is going to be a very interesting conversation. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding on how Interpol works and on what Interpol is. So, Michelle, thank you so much for doing this interview. It's good to see you again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's nice to see you too.
So it's a funny story that we met. The way we met was very interesting because it was 2019. I was on the Interpol Red Notice list, and I spent 9 months there. It was not fun, and it was one of the hardest thing was to get information on what did that mean. And I was already here in the United States. I talked to, I would say, almost a dozen of criminal attorneys.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes.
Before we met.
Before we met. And they had absolutely no clue on how that works.
Yeah.
And until one day, I was talking to a big shot here in Miami, and he was like, you know what? The only person that you were actually lucky because she's in Miami. The only person that can help you is I'm going to give you her contact. And then we met. And what was absolutely amazing is that you were very clear to me, and everything that you said happened. So, and of course it wasn't good, but it's better when you know what's coming.
Sure, that's what I think. I think it's better when you can prepare at least mentally for what's down the line.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And when the other people in Brazil, I have a very good friend, a journalist from Brazil, is one of the most censored journalists in the world. He came here to the United States, and he's currently on the red notice, we think. And I told him everything that was going to happen to him, and he could prepare for that. And that was because of you, because you taught me. I think the way I would like to start is asking you, what exactly is Interpol? Because it's not a governmental agency.
Right.
It's not a company as well, is it?
No, right.
What is it?
So Interpol is, as you said, it's a non-governmental organization. It's an international organization that offers the service of data keeping. Well, for purposes of this conversation, this is the most important service that it offers, is data keeping and data sharing for its member countries. And what that means is if you're one of its 195 member countries, and you've got a person who is alleged to have committed a crime in your country, let's say murder, right? Let's say there's a murder that's been committed in one country and the person is believed to have absconded, have fled the jurisdiction for another country. The idea is that if the country where the person is wanted shares that information, shares the fact that there's an outstanding arrest warrant with Interpol, Interpol is based in Lyon, France, that Interpol will then circulate that information to all of the other member countries. The idea is that it makes it easier for the wanted person to be found and to be stopped. And every member country has a decision to make then. Once they come across that wanted person, what do? They're not obliged to detain them, to extradite them, to do anything. But if they're in Interpol, the idea is that you're going to cooperate with each other. So if your domestic laws allow for it and provide for it, then you're going to follow whatever path it takes in your country to let the other country know, hey, we've got this person. What would you like us to do? And eventually it would lead to extradition. That is not always the way that it happens, but that's the way that the system is set up for the purposes of this conversation. Interpol also does other things, like it helps educate police departments in different jurisdictions on how to more effectively combat certain types of crimes. And it also works they do kind of like multi-jurisdictional efforts whenever there's some big thing, a human trafficking event or a big drug trafficking problem in one country. They assist with multi-jurisdictional efforts to combat that particular crime or set of crimes or phenomenon that's going on. So it's meant to support law enforcement in general. And there's all kinds of different projects that it undertakes, short-term and long-term. I think that the reason I get involved most of the time is because somebody is wanted on the Interpol wanted list and they feel that they should not be. Usually if they feel that it's legitimate, that there's a red notice that's been issued legitimately, they don't come looking for help. They just stay hidden.
I want to get into the woods on all that, but I found it fascinating the way you described Interpol as a data sharing non-governmental organization.
Yes.
So it's because the name is sort of misleading because Interpol, and then we watched the movie. I was telling you, I watched the Red Notice movie with Dwayne Johnson, and then you see why. Wow, you have all these. First of all, they all look great, right?
Right.
They all look great. And then you see them shooting and exploding stuff in the movies. In I think on the Red Notice is like in Egypt, or it's like, wow, these guys are like international police that can do whatever they want.
No.
And it's not like that, right?
No, it's not like that.
It's a data sharing NGO.
It's a data sharing organization that actually operates in Lyon, France under a headquarters agreement. It has authority to operate there by permission of France, but is not necessarily subject to French law.
Okay.
So when you talk about the agents, the individual Interpol officers, that's not a thing, right?
Oh, it's not a thing.
That's not a thing. So
there's no.
They're not running.
Dwayne Johnson
no,
is not
and no. and Interpol is very clear about this, that there are no agents running around enforcing the law. They're sharing the information that will allow local jurisdictions, local departments to enforce their law. So, for example, here in the United States, if somebody were wanted and were the subject of a red notice from, say, Italy, it would be up to the local authorities to decide, are we going to issue an arrest warrant domestically in order to capture the person, in order to either, typically move towards extradition proceedings, or are we not? There's nobody from Interpol proper in Lyon, France, who's going to come over here into the United States and enforce the law of Italy. That's just not a thing.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but what you're saying is that, let's say I committed a crime in Italy, I'm in the United States, and the Italian government puts me on the Interpol Red Notice list, and I want to get into how that works.
Sure.
But there's no risk of an Interpol agent knocks on my door and say, you're under arrest by the order of Interpol.
No, and Interpol would never order that. Interpol doesn't have the authority to order that. They don't want to. That's just not what they're doing at all. There is a risk that there would be, if you're not a U.S. citizen, that there would be a knock on the door by someone from the Department of Homeland Security, or that there would be a knock on the door by local law enforcement, whatever law enforcement agency it might be, and move towards either an extradition proceeding or towards a removal, or what people typically call a deportation proceeding.
Okay.
One of those two things could happen, but those would be by U.S. officials, not by somebody from Italy.
Quem controla o que você vê, o que você lê e até como você deve pensar? A mídia, as elites políticas e o sistema têm se empenhado em manipular as nossas escolhas. Para eles, nós somos ignorantes, incapazes de compreender o que é melhor para nós mesmos. Foi assim que Walter Lippmann, no Public Opinion, justificou o papel de uma imprensa superior para filtrar a realidade ao povo que seria incapaz de ver o mundo com clareza. É exatamente isso que a gente está vendo. A gente está vivendo uma democracia patológica, onde as chamadas instituições democráticas acham que precisam nos proteger de nós mesmos. Eles nos veem como ignorantes, lixo, gado. E é exatamente para expor esse sistema que esse curso foi criado. Quando eu lancei O Fim da América e do Mundo Como Conhecemos, eu sabia que ele transformaria vidas, que abriria os olhos de milhares de pessoas para a verdade. E é isso que ele faz. Ele te transforma e te liberta, te capacitando com discernimento real para se defender das mentiras e simplesmente não enlouquecer. São mais de 40 aulas gravadas, com qualidade profissional e professores renomados de todo o mundo. Tudo para te preparar e instruir para o que ainda está por vir. Além de todo o conteúdo entregue em 10 módulos, você vai receber aulas com 16 professores convidados conhecidos internacionalmente, tudo legendado em português. 6 meses de acesso grátis ao conteúdo exclusivo do meu site. E interação comigo, professor, nas aulas ao vivo e acesso ao grupo do Telegram só para os alunos. Enfim, é a maior e mais completa formação em política e geopolítica disponível no Brasil e na América Latina. Não deixa para depois. Garanta já a sua vaga pelo link que está fixado no chat na descrição da live. As inscrições se encerram ao fim da apuração das eleições e é a última turma. Realmente uma chance única. Participe e prepare-se para ver o mundo como ele realmente é.
And it wouldn't be triggered by Interpol, but by an actual extradition request from the government, or
it could be triggered by, honestly, any contact with law enforcement that happens to check the database that they have access to for Interpol. So you see mostly at ports of entry, somebody's coming in on a cruise, somebody's coming in from a flight. The passenger manifest will be checked before people land. And so if you create a hit,
is it checked before you leave or before you arrive?
I've seen it happen both ways.
Okay.
I've seen people not be allowed to board a flight because they were on the list as a red notice subject.
You mean international flights? Or
yes,
domestic?
On an international flight, typically. I don't typically see it in domestic flights. Doesn't mean it can't happen, but I don't typically see that. More frequently, we see people who have arrived in the United States or in another country, and they are the subject of a hit, a red notice hit, and they're asked to come over to us for a secondary inspection. And it's up to the United States or whatever other jurisdiction is, in which the person lands, what they do with that hit. As I said, they could question them. I've had clients have every type of experience.
Happen? Yeah, just tell me a little bit.
It can range from anything from a few questions and then to be told, oh, you need to sort that out and then let them go on their way. That has happened. It's happened where people have been required to turn around and get back on a plane and go back to where they came from. Okay. It has happened that they have been processed and a local arrest warrant already existed or was activated quickly and they moved towards extradition proceedings. The person was taken into custody and immigration proceedings then took over. So there are a variety of there are a variety of things that can happen. And it's at the discretion of the country in which the person finds themselves. And unfortunately, we often see that there's a lack of uniformity even between officials. So there's not, it sounds like a typical lawyer question. It depends, or answer. It really does depend on who's on duty, what do they do, what do they check, and what country did you land in.
So in the United States, you would to be actually arrested, you would need an order from a judge in the United States, right? Yeah,
if we're going to move towards extradition, for example, you need a domestic arrest warrant to be issued. And that certainly can happen. It can happen swiftly if that's what our authorities decide that they want to do. And if it's a serious enough crime, then certainly that can happen. Very frequently, it doesn't happen. And that might be because there's not been communication between the countries, or the requesting country isn't getting information that is requested over to us in order to act on it. There are a variety of things that need to happen in order for a person to be moved towards extradition, that if any one of those things doesn't happen, then the extradition isn't going to happen.
But the extradition process, is it started by a formal, in Brazil, in case we haven't seen, there are two different things. Brazil puts someone in the Interpol red notice list. But on my case, for example, they did not ask for my extradition. Right. They just put me on the red notice. That triggered the problem with my visa. Yeah. And then ICE actually was the one seeking me out. But in my case, spent after 2 weeks in Chrome.
Mhm.
I was able to see a judge. The judge said, "You're not in a flight risk. I'm going to look into your case." He then finally dismissed. So it was not automatic for me to be extradited. They never asked for it.
Yeah, you were on a separate kind of track, right? Because
Correct.
it went through immigration.
Right.
What happened to you probably would not happen in the same way today, because we recently had a change in policy. So now ICE officials won't act on just a red notice, because there has been a lot of activity at the congressional level, wherein our officials now understand that a red notice is very frequently a tool for abuse.
Right.
So just the red notice alone would not trigger that at this point. There needs to be now a confirmation of that information, obtaining the underlying documentation, and kind of going up the chain of command within ICE to act on that. It's different than it was in 2019,
Right.
which is a good thing. Our officials have recognized that there are major abusers of Interpol. And I think that the catalyst for that change was some very good work done by immigration lawyers and Interpol experts. And luckily, people in charge listened to that. And there had been some good case law that came out regarding the problems that go along with red notices sometimes, and the lack of credibility that they really should come with, given the abuse that has happened. And the countries that were the focal points at that time, I think, were more Russia and China and Venezuela.
Maybe.
But
Iran?
Yeah. Iran, yes. Actually, yeah. Turkey.
Iran issued a red notice against Donald Trump.
Yeah. So there's been all kind of efforts to weaponize.
As well, right?
Venezuela has historically been quite problematic. Yes. It's the only country that I'm aware of that has prompted a Secretary General of Interpol to visit the country and have a discussion about how not to abuse the system. That happened many years ago under a previous Secretary General.
And did they change anything?
Not within my experience. Okay.
No. That's fascinating. I know there's a bill in. It's actually one of the rare cases of bipartisan bill in both House and Senate with co-sponsors from both parties. I happen to know some of them. It's funny because I think one of the main guys is Congressman Chris Smith, who's a Republican I know very well, very good guy. He's one of the sponsors of the bill. The other guy that's a co-sponsor with him is a Democrat that's very, very, very leftist and very much against Brazilian journalists. And his name is Jim McGovern. He's from Massachusetts, and they both support the bill. They're both supporters. So there's a rare case of bipartisan bill support on a bill that's a transnational repression bill that talks specifically about Interpol being used by these countries, and I think it's fair to say that would include Brazil now, to go after political dissidents in the United States.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of that, and it's good that issue has gotten traction and has resulted in changes that are felt by the boots on the ground. A lot of times it takes a long time. Law is slow for our processes to change, slower than most other industries. And so for this policy implementation to occur, obviously it takes time, but now we have this different treatment of red notices, and at least the courts and the officers who are in the coastal communities, where we've got a lot of people coming in seeking asylum or protection, or just escaping the place that they came from, where they're being persecuted. These courts are becoming aware more and more that a red notice is not the trustworthy piece of information that they thought it was. And I think that information is bit by bit trickling into other parts of the country as well. So we are happily seeing that issue treated properly now, that it's something to look out for, it's something to look into, but it's not definitive.
What's fascinating is that it's hard to understand how the process of being included on a red notice works.
Okay.
It's just that the government just sends a request, or is it automatically included in the system? And does Interpol, do they make any sort of like triage on the cases to see if there's merit, if that is being weaponized? Do they do that, or is just the government just press a button and you go on the system and that's it?
So how it works, and then what does Interpol do to kind of combat abuse, right?
Okay.
How it works is every country has their own means by which a local law enforcement, we're here in Miami, so let's talk about Miami.
Okay.
So city of Miami Beach has a crime and a person is either wanted for the crime. Let's stick with murders. That works, right?
Yeah.
They're wanted for the murder, or they've been convicted of the murder and somehow have escaped. So either way, it can be you're wanted to face charges or to serve a sentence that's already been issued. If that person is believed to have fled to another country, then the Miami Beach Police Department is going to reach out to our National Central Bureau in Washington, D.C. and ask for this particular case to become the subject of a red notice, this particular person.
So the police asks, not the court.
Well, some countries, the court does it.
Okay.
So if the police will make the request, the court obviously has issued the arrest warrant,
Okay.
right? So in our case, it would be the police department. They may work with the state attorney's office, or if it's at the federal level with the U.S. attorney's office, we'll have, whoever it is has to reach out to our National Central Bureau. And that's true in every country. The National Central Bureau is the organization that liaises with Interpol. So if I know someone's wanted as a citizen and I want Interpol to get involved, no, that's not going to happen. It has to be a law enforcement agency that's designated by the country to work directly with Interpol. And then that National Central Bureau will provide the required information. And it usually it's required to be a description of the crime, a description of the person, height, nationality, languages spoken, things like that, as much information as possible. What's the nature of the underlying crime? And there has to be the, who, what, where, when, why, that sort of thing, and what they're facing.
I think I'm one of the rare cases, you probably know others, that I actually saw my red notice because it was used in court against me. And they're usually not public, right? They're not.
Most of them are not public. Maybe 10 to 15% will be published on Interpol's website. So if you go to interpol.int and you go to wanted, you can look it up. And
well, that's an interesting thing, a specifically interesting thing. When this journalist, and I learned that from you as well, but when this journalist, Alan dos Santos, was put on the Interpol red notice list, and everyone is saying, well, Brazil asked Interpol to include him on the red notice and all that. Most of the newspapers in Brazil were saying that Interpol did not follow the court order in Brazil because they looked it up on the Interpol website and his name wasn't there. And I was one of the only journalists saying, no, that doesn't mean anything.
Right.
This is like a small percentage. It means the country didn't ask to include his name on the website, correct? But
right, that means Brazil, and it's not that Interpol didn't follow the court's order.
Right.
It's that the Brazilian National Central Bureau requested a red notice to be issued, and if it was issued, which sounds like it was, if it was issued, it wasn't made public, and most of them are not made public, and that makes sense because if you want to catch somebody, you don't tell somebody that you're looking for them.
But now, most likely the name was there, we just didn't know.
If the name is there, if there's a red notice and they haven't published it, you're not going to know until law enforcement finds you.
Is there a way to know?
Sure. And this is, to me, such an interesting topic, the issue of gaining access to your data, your personal data. Interpol has...
Isn't that the law in the United States that you have to have access, but they're not a government agency, so that's interesting.
Well, that's a lot of different questions. But on the question of getting access to your data within Interpol, it's not U.S. law that governs. It's Interpol's rules that govern. And Interpol is allowed to act as an independent organization because it has certain procedures in place and internal mechanisms in place that allow it to operate that way. One of the things that Interpol has in place with respect to data is you as an individual have the right to request access to your data. And unless the member country has a compelling reason not to share that data, they will typically authorize Interpol to share it with you. Sometimes they will say, we don't want to share this because it's an ongoing investigation or a myriad of other reasons that are or are not valid. And I've seen many times when a country, particularly China, I see this with Korea as well, South Korea, decides not to share information. We don't find out the reason for that. We find out the information that we're willing to share, which sometimes is just, this guy is wanted for the crime of fraud, no article number or anything, no real narrative, and they'll say the rest is private.
But
and
at least you can know if you're there or not.
You can know if you're there or not.
Always?
Not always. No, not always. In the old days, years and years ago, a couple of times we got back a response that said, we've got your request, it's admissible, and we are suggesting that you not request this information, which is kind of a weird response. And I don't to this day know why we would get that, but we would write back, yes, we do want it. Now, when you're asking for information, of course, they're going to reach out to the country to ask, can we let the person know that this exists? Is there any reason not to? And that, of course, could stir the pot. Sometimes people who have been forgotten about at the national level could renew interest in a case. And sometimes people are a little hesitant to do that. But usually by the time you get to the point where you're asking, do I have a red notice? It's because you've been immobilized somehow and you need to remedy the situation. And you can't remedy the situation if you don't know what the situation is. So most of the time people do want to know. We don't see that response anymore. Typically we do see a response, a substantive response saying there either is or is not something. And maybe the response is limited if the member country has asked for part of the information to be redacted. We could see that. Yeah.
But how do you ask for?
Oh, you write to Interpol.
You write a letter?
Yeah. You can go on the website and it tells you exactly what steps to follow. And Interpol has a procedure by which you can ask for something to be removed or corrected.
I want to get there.
Yeah.
How long does it take for them to respond if you're there or not?
Just the inquiry is 4 months. Or a request for access just to answer, are you there or are you not there? 4 months.
4 months.
And that takes into account that they're going to give the member country a chance to respond. The member country has 3 months to respond. So you send your letter to Interpol, Interpol processes it. In 30 days, you get an answer back saying, we've got this, it's admissible, meaning you've given us everything we need to open a case or an inquiry, or it's not admissible because you failed to do that. And we will give you a response within the applicable time frame, which is 4 months. And then they will reach out to the National Central Bureau and ask for authorization to release it. So they're holding your data, right?
Right.
So they need authorization to release the data that was put there by someone else.
Oh, that's so interesting. And you were saying that there's a mechanism for you to actually fight back, to say, well, I don't want my name there. This is not fair. This is didn't follow due process and all that. What would be that mechanism?
Well, again, you have to inform Interpol. And so one of the things you asked about before was, what happens if your name is put there and it's a politically motivated thing, right? So if it's a famous person or a famous situation, I mean, Interpol doesn't live in a vacuum, right? The people who work in the Commission for the Control of Interpol's Files, which is the body to which you apply for relief, they can do open source checking and they're aware of who people are in the world. So if a request comes in for someone who's well known or a situation that's, active in the media, they're probably going to catch it, and they're not going to issue that. If some country decided they wanted Joe Biden to be the subject of a red notice, pretty quickly they would notice that this is something that's going to be likely politically motivated and probably they don't want to get involved in it. That happened with Trump,
right.
And that happens sometimes with other heads of state.
I think Vladimir Putin is there as well.
Yeah. And I said before 195 member countries. I was old. It's 196 actually.
It's more than members of the United Nations, I guess.
Muito interessado no resultado da eleição americana. Mas você sabe o que realmente está em jogo? ou está meio perdido? O professor Olavo nos alertou para isso. O que acontece nos Estados Unidos é muito mais do que política interna. É a engenharia de um colapso calculado para influenciar todo o Ocidente, incluindo o Brasil. Estratégia de desinformação, manipulação judicial, infiltração ideológica na mídia, na cultura e até nas igrejas. O que parecia uma democracia sólida se revelou uma estrutura enfraquecida e entregue aos interesses globalistas. Foi por isso que eu criei esse curso. Desde 2021, depois da eleição do Biden, eu juntei tudo que eu aprendi para formar uma geração de brasileiros realmente informada e preparada para o que vem pela frente. Hoje, mais de 6 mil alunos já transformaram a forma como enxergam o mundo. Não é política americana, é sobre resistir, armado com conhecimento, ao avanço da tirania ideológica que se espalha pelo mundo. É um convite a uma compreensão profunda e sem filtros de tudo que tem se desenrolado nas sombras. Eu reuni mais de 15 especialistas de renome e organizei o conteúdo em 10 módulos com mais de 40 aulas para que você possa finalmente entender, em português e com clareza, a verdadeira face dessa guerra cultural e ideológica que domina o cenário global. Hoje, eu trago a última oportunidade para você fazer parte desse bunker da resistência. Se o Trump vencer, você vai saber o que ele vai ter que enfrentar. Se ele não vencer, a gente precisa estar bem preparado para o que vem. Por isso eu decidi abrir essa última turma. Hoje, como forma de incentivo, você pode se inscrever com 30% de desconto, mas é por bem pouco tempo. As inscrições se encerram ao fim da apuração das eleições americanas. É realmente uma chance única. O link para a inscrição está fixado no chat na descrição da live. Essa vai ser a sua última oportunidade. Junte-se a nós e entenda o que realmente está em jogo. Faça parte dessa resistência.
Anybody who's not a member of Interpol's, maybe a place you might not want to go. You know,
right?
Yeah.
I heard they have more members than the United Nations. I actually been in their office, on the Interpol office. In
Did you go to Lyon?
No, to the one in New York.
Ah, okay.
And I looked at the map and I was like, it's very impressive.
Mm.
So let me try to. I know you're not. Of course, you don't follow Brazilian politics, but let me give you just a few information, a little bit of information, and see if you can give us a guess. So Brazil right now, it's been all over the media, the discussion if there's the Supreme Court of Brazil is following due process. A lot of people complaining that they're being persecuted for political reasons, which I happen to know. I'm one of these cases. But we had hearings in the United States Congress. I testified there about that. We have members of the U.S. Congress openly saying that Brazil is not following due process. We have articles on mainstream media. The Wall Street Journal, for example, published a piece a couple of days ago about what's going on in these violations. We have several evidences that there is a reasonable doubt that there's a heavily politically motivated persecution ongoing by the Brazilian Supreme Court. Of course, that depends on which side you are, right? If you're on their side, you say, well, that's fair. These people committed crime. But if you're on the other side, there's at least a good argument. So would Interpol look into that and consider and say, give people that are there the benefit of the doubt? Or would they, I don't care, this is a member, they issued an order, we're going to fulfill the order? And do they make this sort of evaluation? I ask you this because, for example, usually the cases for asylum in the United States, if there's a reasonable doubt that you are actually being politically persecuted, they usually grant the asylum because, well, you have a case, right? There's some people are, you have a congressman saying that, you have cases on the mainstream media. So there is a political persecution. So we'd rather give you the asylum, even if we're not sure, than not to give you the asylum and send you back to a country where you're political. So my question is, does Interpol work the same way? Do they give people the benefit of the doubt?
No, I think I understand your question. And I'm not commenting on the immigration element of it just because I'm not an immigration lawyer. So my silence is not agreement or disagreement. I just don't, it's not my area. Regarding how Interpol is going to look at it, Interpol's decisions have been very, very clear in saying that they are not going to accept as grounds for removal of a red notice a country's general jurisprudential situation of kind of not following due process, even if it's been well documented by, say, Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International or whomever. They will take that into consideration in the general context of the case. But if you cannot assert some sort or offer some sort of substantial competent evidence that happened to you, then you will probably not win your case. In other words,
so they tend to believe the government.
Well, so, every red notice is presumed to be valid because this is an organization in which all of the member countries have undertaken an obligation to uphold their domestic laws, the international laws and treaties to which they're bound, and conventions, that sort of thing, and the rules of Interpol. So there is a presumption that that is happening. That is a tough pill to swallow when we also see on a daily basis evidence in mainstream media that many, many Interpol countries are violating all of the things we just talked about. But in order for the organization to function, this is one of the bases, it's the foundation, is that we've got to presume our countries are doing what they're supposed to be doing. And that presumption is strong. So you have to overcome that presumption and show not just that something in the general context of cases that come out of Brazil, for example, contain a lot of due process violations. You would have to show that in your case, there have been certain events that have occurred, violations of law, violations of your human rights, violations of your co-defendant's human rights. Maybe your co-defendant is there and something so bad happened to your co-defendant that it's not reasonable to think that you're going to get there and all of a sudden get fair treatment in the same court, right? Now, obviously, you want to show Interpol that if there is an ongoing history of certain types of violations, you need to let them know that, because you don't want them making a decision in the vacuum. And things change from year to year in different countries. Sometimes a country will be terrible on providing access to lawyers or family for someone in jail, and that can change in a couple of years. And that does happen sometimes. So you can't just say, just because they've always been bad at this, now I'm going to go there and I'm not going to get to see my lawyer. Instead, you have to actually show that there's a current violation that directly affects your case, and allow Interpol the information to say, yeah, we think that this case is something we don't want to stay involved in because our rules or the domestic laws of the country or international legal standards are being violated, and we are not here to support illegality. We're here to support law enforcement endeavors that are based in law and due process.
It's interesting because of the case of Alan dos Santos. He's on the Interpol Red Notice list as far as we know. And the United States government denied his extradition and told Brazil, look, these crimes you're attributing to him are speech crimes, and we don't have that here. And we don't extradite people because of opinion crimes.
Yeah. And that's an evaluation. So there's an evaluation that is done. You asked about politically motivated crimes, and this is obviously something that we believe is politically motivated, what you're discussing. And we see dissident speech being suppressed by a lot of countries. China is well known for that. We know that Turkey has done that. We're hearing that Brazil is doing that. So there's a very specific criteria that Interpol looks at to decide, is this politically motivated? And it's not just asking, is it politically motivated? It's asking, even if there is a criminal element to it, because sometimes there is an actual crime charge for which there might be some real basis to articulate, right? But if it's predominantly political and not predominantly criminal, Interpol still doesn't want to be involved in it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So there's a set of criteria that they will evaluate, and it's very clear and laid out in their website and their materials that they make available to practitioners and just to lay people. It's a little bit different than the political motivation criteria that happens in other venues or other, in front of other bodies. But in general, it's meant to identify those kinds of proceedings that are really not meant to stamp out crime or punish crime or catch a criminal. It's really meant to oppress free speech or to punish someone who ran afoul of an old government, a previous government regime, something like that.
Right.
I said that wrong. To punish someone who ran afoul of the current government that's in power, and maybe they were with a previous government regime.
Right.
Yeah.
I've seen I met a gentleman in detention that he was the son-in-law of the former president of Egypt, and the Muslim Brotherhood still had some agents on, I don't know, their federal police or something like that, and they put his name on the red notice. He was actually able to take the name out, but by then he was already detained by ICE and following the policy that the U.S. government had back then. So it was a very interesting case. Egypt, Muslim Brotherhood. It's like politically, he was with
it depends. It depends who's in power, and also we have to remember that many countries change the designation of who is and who is not a terrorist organization, depending on whether their goals and their ideology aligns with that particular organization. There's been a lot of controversy about whether the Muslim Brotherhood is or is not actually a true terrorist organization, despite that designation. I'm not saying it either is or it isn't, but there has been a very robust debate about that. And Egypt is one of the countries who in the past has been observed to have abused the red notice system, specifically targeting journalists. That happened in like 2012, 2013. There were a number of journalists who were subject of red notices because of what they wrote about what had happened earlier in Egypt.
Do they look journalist case differently?
What do you mean by that?
I mean, if you're there on the list and you're a journalist, does this like raise an extra concern from them about this being?
I don't know about an extra concern. I think if you apply the rules and the criteria to evaluate a case, most of the time, if it's a journalist, it's going to be pretty straightforward, because if you wrote something bad about someone in power and you got charged with some crime like you might see something like crimes against the well-being of the state or hooliganism. Sometimes you see that.
In Brazil, they usually use crimes against democracy or crimes
something
against
like
Brazilian
this.
institutions.
Yeah, and if what they're saying is you wrote this bad thing and made us look bad as a country or provoke somebody to do something, usually that's pretty instantly recognizable as being politically motivated.
Is there anything that the people from the country, I don't mean the government, but maybe the diaspora of Brazil, that they can do to inform Interpol of what's going on, so they be extra careful evaluating cases coming from the Brazilian Supreme Court or something like that? Is there anything that can be done in that matter?
I think that the most effective thing that can be done from a layperson's perspective is responsible, credible journalism. Because we know that in almost any country today, and some countries are worse than others, you can buy a news article like that.
Sure.
So if you have some media pieces by, a relatively untested or unknown media outlet that is favorable to a client, that's not really helpful. It is helpful when you have a credible, established journalistic outfit that is publishing information that's informative. Journalists, this job is getting more and more dangerous. Exposing truth is more and more dangerous. I do think that Interpol is aware of that. And Interpol definitely considers that, the Commission for the Control of Interpol's Files definitely appears to consider information that is coming from a credible source that has been vetted and that appears to be unbiased and based on observations and objective criteria.
And you said there's a process for you to remove your name.
Mm-hmm.
And from what I understand, you were explaining the process and the criteria. How does it happen? It's the same way that you ask for your information. You open an inquiry on the website. Obviously, the best way to do it is through a lawyer. But even if you have an attorney looking like you, specialist looking into this case, what do? Do you send them a letter? Do you open a case? And how long does it usually take?
Yeah, what we normally do is, once we have a very good basis for believing that there is actually data in a database, and it's not just a red notice. A red notice is for you're wanted for committing a crime,
Okay.
or serving a sentence. We also see quite a few yellow notices, and that's for a missing person. And that usually happens in the context of a custody battle that has gone international.
Oh,
So one country says you have the custody over the children, another country says you have custody over the children, and one of the parents will reach out to Interpol and say, hey, my kid's missing because they went with the other parent. So whatever form the data takes, whether it's a red notice, a yellow notice, or a diffusion, which we can talk about if you want to.
I do.
The goal of removing the data from Interpol's databases is going to include just advising Interpol, why should this data not be there? Why is it that you don't want it there? And usually for us, that will end up being a combination of a lot of different forms of evidence. And it can, it depends on the type of the case, It could be that we have a lot of documents from a civil court. Let's say it's a civil case that somehow somebody would manage to convert to a criminal case because they have access to a local police department or influence over them, or bought an arrest warrant, which happens, and then converted it to a criminal case and then got a red notice out of it. So if that happened, then we want to let Interpol know this is a civil case. This is not something you want to be involved in. And any documentation we have to support it, we would give it to them. If it were in the child custody case, we would want to advise Interpol that we've got competing jurisdictions both saying that this child is been awarded custody, the custody of this child has been awarded to the mom here and the dad here, and Interpol typically doesn't like to get involved in that sort of thing. So we would provide that information. So whatever the information is that supports the claim, we would supply to Interpol. And obviously you're going to cite to the rules that are violated in either the country or the international realm, what it might be the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or some convention, some treaty to which the country is bound. Or Interpol's rules have been violated. Maybe they just didn't give Interpol enough information. Maybe it was a case where it's a crime related to a dowry, right? Because some places still do dowries. When we get married,
Right.
My family has to provide your family with a dowry,
Right.
and it's a contractual arrangement, and it's a legitimate legal arrangement in that country. But since it's related to a cultural norm that doesn't exist in other countries, Interpol doesn't want to be involved in that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And how long does it usually take?
How long? They have 9 months to make a decision.
Oh, 9 months.
And they didn't used to. This time limit.
I remember you telling me that.
Yeah, right after, I think probably after we met was when that new law came into effect, or the new rule rather, which was so necessary because cases would just float, for years. And once that rule went into effect, the commission has been quite good about observing. Quite good about.
I think there's a soccer game ongoing.
Oh, is that what's happening?
Yeah, I think that's Copa America, right?
Who's playing?
I don't know. Maybe I think Brazil played yesterday. Yeah. Colombia.
Okay.
Yeah, it makes sense. We're in Miami. So.
All right. So once they implemented the rule that required a decision within a certain amount of time, the commission has been pretty good about that, and they generally adhere to it. And if they don't, they will usually say, this is what's gone on, or we're going to consider it at the next session, and just keep you informed. So
do you get any sort of information in the meantime?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
We usually ask for the red notice to be blocked while they're studying the case, because anytime we're submitting something to Interpol,
it's like an injunction.
Sure, like an injunction, like just they're deciding to remove it from their system temporarily while they consider the case. And we do that because we're only sending cases where we believe that the rules have been violated and there shouldn't be a notice in the first place. So if that's the case, that should be evident from their reading of it. And if they get a sense that this is something they don't want to be involved in, or that they might not want to be involved in, they will block it. And then during the study of it, it's not in their system anymore. I still don't want a client to travel during that time if that happens, because first of all, they don't always tell us. They'll tell us sometimes and sometimes not. And there's not a rule that requires them to tell us. So, even if it's been blocked, if there's a member country that hasn't updated their system and the client travels and gets stopped, he or she will have a problem. So I like for my clients not to travel if we think there's a red notice, or there has been one, or there might be one, or we're working on one. It's better to stay safe, because when you travel, and this has happened a couple of times, because sometimes people want to do what they want to do, they travel and then they get stopped in whatever the other country is, and I can't help them. And now you got to get another lawyer to help you over there. Right. So it's better to stay put while you're waiting for that decision.
Well, that's fascinating. You mentioned diffusion, and I've read. Brazilian media is usually very poor on how they report these cases, but they usually use the term red diffusion.
Well, there is actually a red diffusion.
What's the difference between the red notice and a red diffusion?
So you asked earlier, and I think we got on another track, you asked about what does Interpol do if, can they approve, how do they approve the red notice? Right. And so if there's certain criteria that is required to be there for the red notice, such as the identification of the person, their vital information, the nature of the crime, kind of a basic narrative or recitation of the facts. If all those things are there and it appears that a valid underlying arrest warrant, probably it's going to be approved, unless they have a reason to think it violates some rule. And if they do, then they don't allow it to be published or circulated. That's a red notice. A red diffusion is not subject to the same things, the same oversight. So where a red notice would get reviewed and then circulated to all member countries, a diffusion, and there could be a red diffusion, a yellow diffusion, a diffusion could just go country to country or country to 3 countries. And it doesn't go through the same review process. So there, as you can imagine, that's kind of a workaround for some countries.
It is.
Yeah. And there have been some famous cases. I'm sure you studied about Bill Browder's case, where Russia just relentlessly pursued him for years, and they utilize a diffusion as well. There are other cases that we've dealt with and certainly read about, wherein a diffusion was utilized probably specifically because the information that was needed to get a red notice just didn't exist. So the oversight was not necessary or wanted. And so they issued the diffusion. And you can do a diffusion that goes to everybody or just to another country or a couple of countries. Yeah.
Sounds
problematic. Yeah. Typically, it has been my experience. I can't say this happens always because I don't know what happens always, but it's been my experience that if data is in someone's name is deemed to be inappropriate for Interpol's involvement, I've never had a case where later another form of data was entered in that person's name without us being advised about it first. Because of the fact that we know that there have been efforts to issue diffusions country to country without Interpol's oversight, we know that there is abuse that happens, right? In very politically motivated, very politically sensitive cases. All in all, I don't think this is a widespread problem. I'm saying this based on just anecdotal evidence, but it's certainly a possibility if there's sufficient motivation by a member country to really track a person and abuse its access to Interpol's tools.
My last question. We know that, I don't know what's the proper title, if it's the chief of Interpol or the director of Interpol.
Secretary General, I
Secretary
think you're going to talk
General,
about
maybe.
right now.
The next guy in charge of Interpol is going to be a Brazilian. And that's the first time it happens, and it's happening in a moment where we have, I would say, almost 100 cases of people that claim they're being politically, and I agree with them, just to be clear, that but they claim they're being politically persecuted around the world. Some of them are in Argentina. Some of them are in the United States. I believe some of them in Portugal as well. Now, we're talking about almost 100 people that were asked to be included on Interpol. First of all, do you think it's problematic that the Secretary General will be someone from a country that is allegedly abusing their Interpol system? And second, what is the power that this person would have?
So the Executive Committee of Interpol has nominated him to be the next Secretary General. There has to be a vote at the Annual General Assembly, but he's the presumed incoming Secretary General, absent something else happening.
So there's still a vote that's going to be held?
There's still a vote, but...
Okay. So it's formal, like the Biden nomination, right?
We're going to talk about that right now. So he's the presumptive next Secretary General, yes. And, whether that's problematic is kind of a question for Interpol, because if your goal is to be perceived as and act as an international law enforcement organization, ideally, the helm is headed by somebody or is assumed by somebody who is working in the capacity of one who's enforcing the law, right? And when we say enforcing the law, that presumes that it's done in a legal manner. Now, the person you're talking about has already worked at Interpol or with Interpol for a very long time, in different capacities. I believe trained at FBI Quantico, like has significant law enforcement background,
yes,
and very well may have completely and solely legitimate means of enforcing the law as his experience. I don't know him. I can't tell you. I think the optics
looks like it's not a bad guy. Just about, but he's
the optics are not great.
For a government.
Yeah, the optics are not great. But Interpol's already dealing with that, and they're not with the current Secretary General, but with the current president, who has much more limitation on powers, but still has some power. The current president is from United Arab Emirates, and there were a lot of concerns before he took office. Another previous president, was from China.
Oh wow!
Right, and I have to tell you, the Commission for the Control of Interpol's Files, the body to which I seek or to which I apply for relief for my clients, is appears to be fairly insulated from the politics that go on in the rest of the organization. Obviously, I can only speak anecdotally because there is not an open body of case law, cases that have been decided by the commission. There's some examples that are made public, and heavily redacted, but there isn't, a body of law that you could look at or decisions that you could look at to really quantify what the decisions have been for each country and what the grounds were. That's not in existence. So I can only speak anecdotally. I will say that while the president was a Chinese man, I had cases from China that I thought were handled fairly. I will say that now, currently, even with the president being from the UAE and having the concerns that came along with that, him assuming that position, I have cases from that region that have been decided fairly by the commission. So I think it's always a difficult answer, but the true answer in this case is that we have to expect the worst and hope for the best, because it is a concern. And if you think of, Interpol as just as a business in general, if you're in the business of law enforcement and the guy heading your agency is coming from a place with all of the problems that you've described, maybe he wouldn't get the job if this were a private organization. because the optics are bad. But, that's really a question more for Interpol, I think. How do they want to be perceived, or how does it want to be perceived?
It's fascinating. For everyone that's watching this and the Portuguese dub version later, how they can reach out to you if they, and some of them will need legal assistance?
They can come online, look up Michelle Estlund, look up Interpol attorney, and they can call 305-448-0077 to the office. I also have a blog.
A lot of good information there.
Yeah, I try to put information that kind of can demystify the process. So if you look up noticejournal.com.
Okay.
Yeah. Then there's lots of different topics that I write about, anywhere from just defining what is a red notice and how does it work? What are the timetables? What happens if I win? What happens if I lose? What are the collateral issues? So if you look up rednoticelawjournal.com, you'll find it.
Thank you so much. That was very informative.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Liberdade de expressão sufocada como nunca antes. Eu avisei. Expulso, censurado, minhas redes apagadas, meu passaporte cancelado, contas congeladas, exilado do Brasil, e não parou por aí. Quando Donald Trump deixou a presidência em 2021, eu disse que o fim da América seria o fim do mundo como conhecíamos. E tudo se cumpriu. Famílias destruídas, escolas e universidades tomadas, a mídia e redes sociais manipuladas. A geopolítica global está em chamas, nos Estados Unidos, no mundo e no Brasil. E você está vendo o caos, mas você sabe realmente o que está acontecendo? Alguns desistiram, outros querem lutar, mas você sabe contra quem ou contra o que você realmente está lutando? É tudo desinformação para criminalizar a opinião direita e justificar medidas autoritárias que ele já vem tomando. E você acha que está lutando uma guerra local, mas e se eu te disser que essa guerra é global? Eu sei o que está acontecendo e decidi que vou lutar até o fim. Mas eu não posso vencer essa guerra sozinho. Eu preciso de você. Eu preciso que você entenda o que realmente está em jogo. Eu já formei um exército de mais de 6.000 alunos, nesse que é o maior curso de política global já ministrado no Brasil. Agora, nós estamos nos capítulos finais dessa luta pela nossa civilização. Essa é a última turma e, portanto, sua última chance de fazer parte desse grupo. O fim da América e do mundo como conhecemos. Essa é a sua última chance de se preparar.